Scenes and Adventures in the Semi-Alpine region of the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, 1853, by Rowe, Schoolcraft. Incidents of Travel, Chapter 1, Number 4. I reached the junction of the Ohio with the Mississippi on the last day of June, 1818, with feelings somewhat akin to those of one who performs a pilgrimage. For that Algonquin name of Mississippi had been floating through my mind ever since boyhood, as if it had been invested with a talismanic power. The reading of books of geography, however, makes but a feeble impression on the mind compared to the actual objects. Born on one of the tributaries of the Hudson, a stream whose whole length from the junction of the Mohawk is less than 200 miles, I had never figured to myself rivers of such magnificent length and velocity. I had now followed down the Ohio and all its windings 1,000 miles. It was not only the longest, but the most beautiful river which I had ever seen, and I felt something like regret to find it at last swallowed up, as it were, by the turbid and repulsive Mississippi. The latter was at its summer flood and rushed by like a torrent, which seemed to be overcharged with the broken-down materials of half a continent. De Soto had been the first European to gaze upon this heady mass of waters, urging downward everything that comes within their influence, and threatening to carry even their own banks into the Gulf. We came in a large, heavily manned barge to the very point of the influx of the Ohio, where Cairo is now located. It was early in the afternoon, but the captain of our craft, who was a stout-hearted fellow, of decision of character and a full-toned voice, deemed it best to come to here and wait till morning to grapple with the Mississippi. There were some old arks on the point, which had been landed in high water and were now used as houses. But I retained my berth in the barge, and after looking around the vicinity, amused myself by angling from the sides of the vessel. The only fish I caught was a gar, that almost single variety of the voracious species in these waters, which has a long bill with sharp teeth for arousing its prey, apparently, from a muddy bottom. The junction of two such streams as the Ohio and Mississippi exhibits a remarkable struggle. For miles along the eastern shores of the Mississippi, the clear blue waters of the Ohio are crowded to the banks, while the furious current of the former, like some monster, finally gulps it down, though the mastery is not obtained, I am told, till near the Chickasaw Bluffs. Early in the morning, 1st July, the voice of the captain was heard, and the men paraded the sides of the deck with their long poles shod with iron, and we were soon in the gurgling, muddy channel, struggling along its eastern shore. The men plied their poles with the skill of veterans, planting them as near the margin of the channel as possible, and placing the head of the pole against the shoulder while they kept their footing by means of slats nailed across the footway. With every exertion, we made but 5 miles the first day. This slowness of ascent was, however, very favorable to observation. I was the only passenger on board, except 2 adventurers from the Youghiogheny in western Pennsylvania, who had freighted the barge and were in the position of supercargoes. Such tugging and toiling I had never before seen. It seemed to me that no set of men could long stand it. The current ran as if it were charged with power to sweep everything down its course. Its banks were not proof against this impetuosity, and frequently fell in with a noise and power which threatened to overwhelm us. This danger was often increased by the floating trees, which had fallen into the stream at higher points, and when, after a severe day's toil, the captain ordered the boat to be moored for the night, we felt an insecurity from the fear that the bank itself might prove treacherous before morning. Nothing in the structure of the country appeared to present a very fixed character. The banks of the river were elevated from 10 to 15 feet above the water and consisted of a dark alluvium bearing a dense forest. When they became too precipitous, which was an indication that the water at these points was too deep for the men to reach bottom with their poles, they took their oars and crossed to the other bank. When night came on in these damp alluvions and darkness was added to our danger, the scene was indeed gloomy. I remember this evening we tried most perseveringly to drink our tea by a feeble light, which appeared to be a signal for the collection of insects far near, who by their numbers and the fierceness of their attacks made it impossible to bring our cups to our mouths without stopping to brush away the fierce and greedy hordes of mosquitoes. Amongst the growth, cane and cottonwood were most conspicuous. I had a specimen of boatman manners today, which should not certainly be a subject of surprise, considering the rough and ready life and character of that class. Having laid down on the top deck of the barge a mineralogical specimen to which I attached value and gone temporarily away, I found on my return that it had been knocked to pieces by one of the men, who acted probably like the boy who broke the fiddle to get the music out of it. On expressing my disapproval of this to one who evidently had not the most distant idea of the scientific value of a stone, he made some trite remark that there was more where this come from, and then, stretching himself up at his full length of 6 feet, with sinews which had plainly become tense and hard from the use of the setting pole, he exclaimed, "Help yourself." July 2nd. The toils of this day were similar to those of the last. It was a perpetual struggle to overcome the force of the current by poles placed in the bed, and when that became too deep, we sought for shallower shores. We encountered the same growth of trees along the banks. The land became somewhat more elevated. The insects were in such hordes that it was amazing. We proceeded but about 6 miles today, and there were miles of incessant toil. July 3rd. To the ordinary dangers and efforts of this day were added the frequent occurrence of snags and sawyers or planters, terms which denote some of the peculiar impediments of Mississippi navigation. The captain of our craft, who was a courageous and vigilant man, was continually on the lookout to avoid these dangers, and put to at night at the foot of a large cane-covered island, by which he avoided in some measure the sweep of the current, but was yet in jeopardy from falling in banks. He requested me in this exigency to take a pole, and from the bow sound for bottom, as we crossed the river, to avoid shoals. This I did successfully. We estimated our ascent this day at 7 miles. July 4th. The perils and toils of the crew did not prevent their remembrance of the national anniversary, and the captain acknowledged their appeal in the morning by an extra measure of Old Monongahela. We then set forward against the wild, raging current. From the appearance of the wild turkey and large gray squirrel ashore, it was probable that we are passing out of the inundated region. In other respects, the face of the country and its productions appear the same. After ascending about 6 miles, when the time approached for looking out for a place to moor for the night, a storm of wind suddenly arose, which dashed the water into the barge. We put ashore in haste at a precipitous bank of an island, which fell in during the night very near to us and put us in momentary peril. To leave our position in the dark would be to take the risk of running afoul of snags or encountering floating trees, but as early as the light appeared on the morning of the 5th, we left the spot immediately, crossing to the western bank. By diligence, we made 8 miles this day, which brought us to the first settlement at Tiawapata Bottom on the Missouri shore. This is the first land that appears sufficiently elevated for cultivation. The settlement consists of 6 or 8 farms, where corn, flax, hemp, potatoes, and tobacco are abundantly raised. The peach and apple tree also thrive. I observed the pawpaw and persimmon among the wild fruits. July 6th. The downward movement of the water and its gurgling and rush as it meets with obstacles is very audible after the barge has been fastened to the shore for the night, when its fearful impetuosity, surcharged as it is with floating racks of forest life, is impressive to the listener, while night has thrown her dark pall over the scene. Early in the morning, the oarsmen and polemen were at their masculine toils. I had feared that such intense application of muscle in pushing forward the boat would exhaust their strength, and we had not gone over 3 miles this day when we were obliged to lay by for the want of more competent hands. The complaining men were promptly paid and furnished with provisions to return. While detained by this circumstance, we were passed by a boat of similar construction to our own, laden with planks from Olean on the sources of the Allegheny River in New York. This article had been transported already more than 1,300 miles on its way to a market at St. Louis, where it was estimated to be worth $60 per 1,000 feet. While moored along this coast the day after we had thus escaped from the treacherous island, we seemed to have taken shelter along a shore infested by wild beasts. "Grizzly bear," was the cry at night. We were all alarmed by a snorting and disturbance at the water's edge, a short distance below us, which it was soon evident proceeded from a large, light-colored, and furious animal. So far, all agreed. One of our Pennsylvanians, who had a choice rifle, prepared himself for the attack. The captain, who had no lack of resolution, and would at any rate have become bold by battling the Mississippi River for 6 or 7 days, had some missiles, and all prepared to be useful on the occasion. As I carried nothing more deadly than a silver crucible and some acids, I remained on the upper deck of the barge. From this elevation I soon saw by the dim moonlight the whole party return without having fired a gun. It turned out that the cause of this unusual disturbance was a large white hog, which had been shot in the head and snout with swan shot by some cruel fellows the preceding day, and came at night to mitigate his burning and festering wounds by bathing in the river. July 7th. Having procured some additional hands, our invincible captain pressed stoutly forward, and at an early hour we reached the head of Tiawapeta Bottom, where a short stop was made. At this point, the bed of the Mississippi appears to be crossed by a chain of rocks, which oppose, however, no obstruction to its navigation. Such masses of it as appear on shore are silico-carbonates of lime, and seem to belong to the metalliferous system of Missouri. About half a mile above the commencement of this chain, I observed, at the foot of an elevation near the water's edge, a remarkable stratum of white aluminous earth of a rather dry and friable character, resembling chalk, and which, I afterwards observed, was extensively used by mechanics in Missouri as a substitute for that article. Masses, and in some instances mock nodules of hornstone resembling true flint, are found embedded in it, yet it is not to be confounded with the chalk formation. It yields no effervescence with nitric, and is wholly destitute of carbonic acid. Portions of the stratum are colored deeply by the red oxide of iron. Scattered along the shores of the river at this place, I observed large, angular masses of pudding stone, consisting chiefly of siliceous pebbles and sand cemented by oxide of iron. I now began to breathe more freely. For 7 days we had been passing through such a nascent region, down which the Mississippi swept at so furious a rate, that I never felt sure at night that I should behold another day. Had the barge any day lost her heading and got athwart the stream, nothing could have prevented the water from rushing over her gunwales and sweeping her to destruction, and the whole district of the alluvial banks was subject to be momentarily undermined, and frequently tumbled in, with the noise and fury of an avalanche, threatening destruction to whatever was in the vicinity. Owing to the increased firmness of the shore and the reinforcement of hands, we ascended this day 10 miles. We began to feel in better spirits.